مشان قانونين مش نازل طالعة تفشلوها. مشان شو يا الله، مشان شو؟
يصرخ ألما فقدا غرقا بدم ابنه. هو وجع، لأن سؤال لماذا قتلوا ابنك لا تكفيه أجوبة العالم. فيا أيوب الصبر.
بنتي موتوها، وبنتي يا عمري انتي بنتي.
نعم، تبكيها تعانقها، فغض الطفولة باق فيها. عذرا ثم عذرا صباح مدينتها، ستبقى ضحكتها حبيسة حساب من قتلوها من صناع الموت. جلهم أطفال يمشون في تشييع، فبات تشييعا على تشييع، وشهادة على طفولة على شهادة. فأيما القيمة أنتم أهلها يا جبروت جرمانا. 12 شهيدا و48 جريحا بسيارة مفخخة وضعت أمام مقبرة جرمانا ساعة قدوم مشيعي تفجيرين منفصلين في ليلة سبقت هذا الصباح.
Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today is Wednesday, August 29th, 2012, and I'm Darko. This first article I have up is Insurgents Kill Civilians in Damascus Countryside. Obviously I'm going to be covering Syria, Iran, and just a stack load of articles that have been just a lot of stuff that's kind of going on right now basically in the Middle East, and that armed groups fighting against the Syrian government have a number of civilians, including women, in the Damascus countryside. According to Syria officials, it says the terrorists then gathered the bodies of the victims and put them in a mosque. It was not immediately clear how many people were killed in the attack. Some reports say as many as 20 civilians were killed. So it says here, Sana also said that the foreign-backed insurgents murdered the citizens under the eyes of inhabitants, and that they had planned to blow up the mosque and then blame the attack on government forces. Lastly, earlier on Wednesday, armed groups attacked a military checkpoint, it says here in Zamalka, and killed a number of Syrian troops. Next up, West is scripting scary scenario in Syria. So the conflict in Syria is unfolding like a predictable plot line, a script that appears to be a rerun of some Hollywood cliche movie, only the script is being written with the outrageous cynicism in Washington, along with its criminal co-stars, Britain and France. It starts off by talking about the tugging on public heartstrings. This week, the Western powers are emoting about the plight of the hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring out of Syria into neighboring countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. You have the French president saying that Western powers will have to set up a no-fly zone inside Syria to act as a buffer area in order to relieve the humanitarian crisis. Holland and his American and British counterparts are portraying themselves as knights in shining armor riding to the rescue of helpless victims. Talking about a moral duty, this is what I was talking about, in the guise of humanitarianism. Such a portrayal is a grotesque distortion of reality. It says these theatrics by Western powers is a rerun of NATO's intervention in Libya last year, which was carried out under the pretext of responsibility to protect, or R2P, for human rights. In other words, it's the same lies and fabrications, the same horror and suffering, and the same Western criminals posing as heroes. Something that was just covered recently was about the UK dispatching troops on the ground in Syria. Actually, 200 elite SAS troops. It says here, nearly 200 troops from the Special Air Service SAS and the Special Boat Service SBS and around Syria to collect information about the country's alleged chemical weapons. They're working alongside with the British foreign spying apparatus MI6 to gather intelligence about the movement of Syrian armed forces, along with what? To basically, quote, secure alleged chemical weapons. Also, you have American French troops are also busy working along, and it says here, to destabilize Syria. This is something out of a Frederick Forsyth thriller, but it's true and a lot of people could get killed, said the senior British expert, which was reported in the Daily Star. So remember what I talked about in the last couple months and recently is they're not giving Syria much of a choice with the chemical weapons. If they move them, they're going to go in there and attack them. If they move them just to keep them safe from the terrorists, they're going to go in there and attack them, or it gives them the right to go in there and bring troops in and intervene militarily. If they basically get in the hands of the terrorists, which they are trying to do because Israel is giving them reconnaissance intelligence to do so, then that will give them a reason, oh, the chemical weapons are in the hands of the terrorists, so let's go in there. And then they create a situation like in Libya where they know there's going to be an outpour of refugees going into Europe, mostly I think it was Italy or Spain, and they knew this, that it was going to cause this mass emigration and refugees. So then they can declare R2P, rights to protect all humanitarianism. So this is all set up. Now the biggest news in the recent days is Iran sending its own special forces into Syria. So this would be a big deal, because if this is true, then this is a big step for Iran and this part of the world. Iran said to supply Syria with elite force. It says here from Damascus, Syria, Iran has begun supplying Syria with an elite force trained in obliterating military uprisings. Force members said after Iran promised to help Syria if asked. The quiet shipment of hundreds of members of Iran's 125,000-man army of the Guardians of the Islamic Revolution, or Revolutionary Guard Corps, to Syria, in addition to Tehran's stepped-up efforts to Assad's military with cash and arms, says the Wall Street Journal. So we all know that the Quds Force reports directly to the Iranian Supreme Leader. It's also a part of an initiative in which Iran replaces low-ranking Syrian soldiers who defected with Iranian troops, furnishes Syria with a paramilitary volunteer militia that could support Syria's Alouette paramilitary, it says here, known as Shabia, and provide an unconventional warfare special operations Quds Force to spearhead military cooperation with Assad forces. It says, today we are involved in fighting every aspect of a war, a military one in Syria and a cultural one as well, says this general, a Guards unit commander told volunteer trainees in a speech on Monday, and that was the most that we got as far as a quote. In other words, it could not be independently verified, just so you know. So something that was mentioned by a viewer recently, they asked me what I thought was going to happen, and I do agree with them as far as it's most likely not going to be a direct attack by Iran on Israel, or Israel on Iran, because Israel doesn't have the support, and they know that it'll basically unite Iranians. And so what I think is it really does, this whole thing with Syria has to do with Iran and spilling over, and basically them losing one of their biggest allies. So my point here is to keep an eye on this degrading situation in Syria as far as the refugees, as far as Iran's involvement, and Hezbollah, along with the chemical weapons, and now these troops, the no-fly zone, R2P, that it seems to be all be coming together recently. Senior CFR official says Free Syrian Army needs al-Qaeda support. Going back to what I just said, though, a good example, I'm talking about a false flag here, as far as these chemical weapons getting in the hands of the terrorists, the foreign-backed, Western-backed terrorists, and then blowing a bunch of people up, civilians, and then blaming it on the government. That would be a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So the senior CFR official says Free Syrian Army needs al-Qaeda support. Well, they're already getting it, but it says here that top strategists at the Council on Foreign Relations is crediting al-Qaeda forces in Syria with the resurgence of the rebellion against Assad's government. The Syrian rebels would be measurably weaker today without al-Qaeda in their ranks, a senior fellow of the Middle East Studies at the CFR has said. Interesting, he says here that the Free Syrian Army battalions are tired, divided, chaotic, and ineffective, which is why they're doing things of desperation, like killing all these civilians and blowing up people in funerals and stuff like that. Feeling abandoned by the West, that's right, they're blaming the West now for not helping them. They're demoralized as they square off against Assad's government and weapons. It says here, al-Qaeda fighters, however, may help improve morale. The influx of jihadists brings discipline, religious fervor, battle experience from Iraq. The same ones that killed American soldiers. These are the same ones that people like Hillary Clinton are on board with. They're members of the CFR. funding from Sunni sympathizers in the Gulf. I wonder who those could be. And most importantly, deadly results. In the short, the FSA needs al-Qaeda now. And more big news, just like in Libya, the National Transitional Council, France tells Syrian rebels, form your own government and we'll support it. Just like France was the ones that were backing the no-fly zone. So this literally is like a rerun of Libya, unfortunately. Syrian opposition, but like I said before, the difference is that Syria is actually getting support from Iran, and I think indirectly from Russia, although Russia is just, it seems like they're doing a lot of talk right now. But in the long run, it's all about business and strategic interests. Syrian opposition announces a roadmap for post-Assad Syria. So now they tell them to set up their own government, and they'll recognize it and support it. And what do? The Free Syrian Terrorists announce a roadmap for post-Assad Syria. So they've drafted a political roadmap for the country's development in the event of the regime change. The project, initiated by U.S. and German think tanks, the CFR, is currently being presented in Berlin. The U.S. Institute of Peace. The Day After Project is what they're calling it, supporting a democratic transition in Syria. So NATO terrorists are targeting Syria and Algeria, NATO's pan-Arab terrorist blitzkrieg. So obviously, we're not going to get through all of this in this first video. I may be doing 3 videos to cover all of this. So it says here, Western policymakers admit that NATO's operations in Libya have played the primary role in emboldening al-Qaeda's faction, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. It says here, the Fortune 500 funding Brookings Institute, which I've covered before, Bruce Riedel in his article wrote, the new al-Qaeda menace admits that this faction is now heavily armed thanks to NATO's intervention in Libya, and that this faction's base in Mali, North Africa, serves as a staging ground for terrorist activities across the region. So we're talking about the Libyan Islamic fighting group's U.S.-facilitated terror tidal wave. So that was probably the whole point of going into Libya, to create a base, right? A jumping base. It's also a smuggling corridor. But what they say, they have this faction going into Algeria. There's Mali right there, going over to Afghanistan, and then over here in Syria. So it says here that the feared global Salafate, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, neocons have been scaring Western children with for a decade, is now taking shape via U.S., Saudi, Israeli, and Qatari mechanisms, basically, not Islam. In fact, real Muslims have paid the highest price in fighting this real war against Western-funded terrorism. So this al-Qaeda faction, like their Libyan counterparts, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, are both listed by the U.S. State Department as foreign terrorist organization. Likewise, both the U.K. Home Office and the UN recognize both organizations as terrorists, kind of like the Mujahideen and Taliban, that, again, the United States is in bed with and actually helped create. So remember, that whole Arab Spring thing started as peaceful activists. It says what unfolded was a premeditated lie where placard-waving activists overnight turned into battle-hardened, heavily armed, tank-driving, jet-flying militants waging a nationwide battle against Libyan leader Gaddafi. Finishing up, in reality, it was a fruition of 30 years of covert support the West has poured into militant groups across the region, support that would not end with the fall of Gaddafi. So we were talking about refugees and stuff like that, and pulling on heartstrings of emotional support. Secret compound in Jordan desert houses 1,200 defectors. So an isolated stretch of Jordanian desert, heavily guarded secret compound houses 1,200 senior police and army officers who defected from nearby Syria. These are most likely low-ranking, like they were talking about, or they got paid a buttload of money. It says here, I'm talking like 20 million. It says here, Turkey closes border to displace Syrians. So Turkey has closed its border to fleeing Syrians, leaving thousands of displaced people stranded on its border. They quoted certain authorities saying the number of Syrian refugees being sheltered in Turkish camps has surpassed 80,000. The country is not able to host more refugees. Interesting comment, haha, Turkey closed its borders on refugees but opened its borders to terrorists, which they have. It says here they hold only 80,000 refugees, but I bet they will welcome 500,000 foreign mercenaries. So if the Syrian government's violent crackdown on the peaceful civilian protests, this is back in February, mind you, movement triggers a massive humanitarian crisis, forcing millions to flee to Turkey's southern border, analysts claim that this could constitute an Article 5 situation, which could lead to call for NATO Collective Defense Initiative, i.e. no-fly zone. So you have Egypt is opposing foreign military intervention in Syria along with... And when we return in part 2, we'll talk about Israel and Iran. Thank you.